The air in the county courthouse felt heavier than usual that morning. It wasn't just the thick heat of late summer, though the ceiling fans did little to stir the sluggish atmosphere. It was the kind of heaviness that came when a small town gathered for something everyone had been whispering about for weeks. By the time the bailiff called the room to order, nearly every bench was packed. Shopkeepers had closed early. Retired farmers had driven in from the outskirts. Teenagers, who would normally rather be anywhere else, fidgeted with excitement, eager to see the drama unfold. Some came out of curiosity, others because they felt a stake in the outcome. Everyone knew someone connected to the trial. At the center of it all was the case of Keller v. Dawson, a dispute that had started with broken windows and shouted accusations and grown into something far larger. For months, the two families at its core had been at odds, hurling blame and threats, until the matter was dragged into court. No one had expected it to get this far, but here they were, gathered in a polished wood chamber under the eyes of Judge Harold Bennett. Bennett was a man whose reputation in town was as sturdy as the oak gavel he kept by his side. He'd presided over cases for 30 years, but this one carried a strange energy. He had noticed it the moment he stepped into the courtroom. There was a kind of charge in the air, as though everyone expected something unusual to happen, and the judge suspected it had little to do with the actual evidence. At the prosecution table sat Mr. Keller, a wiry man in his late 50s with eyes that never stopped scanning the room, as though searching for invisible threats. His attorney, a sharp-tongued woman from the city, arranged her papers with brisk efficiency. Across the aisle sat the Dawson family, younger, louder, and far more restless. Mr. Dawson shifted in his seat, whispering too loudly to his lawyer, earning a stern glance from the bailiff. But despite the family's animosity, despite weeks of testimony from neighbors and so-called witnesses, the case remained stubbornly unresolved. Too many accusations, too little proof. The evidence was thin, the words conflicting, and the truth seemed lost in a haze of anger and pride. And then, in the middle of it all, sat a child. Her name was Emily Carter. She was only 8 years old, and unlike anyone else in that room, she had not chosen to be there. Her mother had tried to shield her from the proceedings, but Emily had insisted she had something important to say, something the adults were ignoring. Against her better judgment, her mother had allowed her name to be submitted. Now she sat quietly on the witness bench, her small hands folded in her lap, her shoes barely touching the floor. To most of the adults in the room, she looked out of place, too young, too fragile, a child caught in a storm that had nothing to do with her. But to Emily, this was her moment. She believed she could help, though no one had listened before. Beside her mother in the gallery, lying with his head between his paws, was Max, a golden retriever with fur, the color of late summer wheat, and eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. He was not supposed to be in the courthouse, but after much persuasion, the judge had allowed it, noting that the dog appeared calm and well-behaved. Still, his presence drew murmurs. "Why is the dog here?" One man whispered to his neighbor. "They say he saw something," came the reply, followed by a chuckle of disbelief. The bailiff rapped his gavel once more, and the room stilled. Judge Bennett cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed with further testimony, we will hear from one final witness." He paused, his eyes settling on the child at the front. Emily Carter. A name rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Some frowned in confusion. Others leaned forward with interest. The Dawsons' attorney smirked openly, as though the very idea of a child's testimony amused him. Mr. Keller, on the other hand, looked hopeful for the first time in weeks. Emily rose slowly, her mother giving her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder as she passed. She looked small against the heavy wooden backdrop of the courtroom. When the bailiff asked her to raise her right hand and swear to tell the truth, her voice was quiet but clear. "I promise." The judge watched her closely. There was something in her demeanor, a mix of nerves and determination, that made him hesitate before speaking again. "Miss Carter, do you understand why you've been asked to come here today?" Emily nodded, her pigtails bouncing slightly. "Yes, sir." "Because Max saw what happened." The courtroom erupted in whispers. A few chuckled. Others shook their heads. The judge silenced them with a sharp crack of his gavel. "You mean your dog?" he asked carefully. Emily met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, Max knows the truth." For a moment, Judge Bennett considered ending it there. Dogs did not give testimony. The law was clear. But something in Emily's steady expression gave him pause. He could sense the room leaning in, waiting to see what would happen next. And though he would never admit it aloud, a small part of him, the part that had grown weary of half-truths and evasions over the past weeks, wanted to hear what the child would say. The attorneys exchanged glances. The Dawsons' lawyer leaned back with an indulgent grin, arms crossed as though preparing for entertainment rather than evidence. The prosecutor, meanwhile, shifted her papers aside, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Emily sat down, her legs swinging nervously beneath the tall chair. She glanced toward Max, who lifted his head as if sensing her unease. Then she turned back to the judge. "Grown-ups don't believe me," she said softly, "but Max remembers. He always remembers." The judge raised a brow. "Remembers what, exactly?" She hesitated, chewing her lip, then whispered, "Who was there that night?" "Who scared Mr. Keller?" Max knew, and he tried to tell everyone, but nobody listened. The silence in the room was heavy. For weeks, the case had been mired in conflicting stories. And now, here was an 8-year-old suggesting that the missing piece of the puzzle had been with them all along, not in the form of a human witness, but a dog. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, Judge Bennett leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The courtroom waited. Emily, small but resolute, sat with her hands folded, her gaze unwavering. And beside her, Max thumped his tail softly against the floor, as though punctuating her words. For the first time since the trial began, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The unlikely witness had arrived. The courtroom had quieted, but beneath the silence lurked tension as sharp as a drawn blade. Judge Bennett adjusted his spectacles and glanced over his notes. He knew this wasn't merely a case of property damage. It was a powder keg fueled by months of resentment between two families who once lived side by side in uneasy peace. Now they sat on opposite ends of the courtroom, glaring daggers across the aisle. The origins of the dispute went back nearly a year. The Kellers had lived in town for decades, salt-of-the-earth people, respected if not universally liked. Their neighbor, Richard Dawson, had moved in only 5 years earlier with his wife and 2 teenage sons. From the beginning, things hadn't gone smoothly. Dawson was brash, quick-tempered, and had little patience for the quieter traditions of the community. Where the Kellers prized order and privacy, the Dawsons valued noise and display. Their backyard gatherings often stretched late into the night with music, fireworks, and shouting, much to Keller's dismay. The trouble escalated when Mr. Keller accused the Dawson boys of vandalizing his property. First, it was tire tracks across his garden, then broken fence panels. The incidents grew more deliberate. Windows shattered by thrown rocks, spray-painted insults on his shed, even threatening notes slipped into his mailbox. The Dawsons denied everything, laughing off the accusations. "Boys will be boys," Richard Dawson had sneered more than once. But things came to a head one night when Mr. Keller awoke to the sound of glass breaking. He rushed outside to find the front of his house defaced, his flower beds destroyed, and his mailbox twisted beyond repair. In the shadows, he swore he saw a figure dart away. He shouted, but no one responded. The only one beside him was Max, barking wildly at the darkness. From that night on, the Kellers pressed for legal action. They claimed they had endured months of harassment, culminating in this act of destruction. The Dawsons, in turn, countersued, claiming Keller was slandering their family and harassing their children. The feud had spilled into the community, dividing neighbors and fueling gossip. Now, in the crowded chamber, the air was thick with that history. Everyone in town had an opinion. Some sympathized with Mr. Keller, seeing him as an elderly man, tormented by unruly neighbors. Others sided with the Dawsons, arguing Keller was a bitter man picking on teenagers for harmless antics. The jury, caught between conflicting testimonies, looked weary. For weeks, witness after witness had taken the stand. A neighbor testified to hearing shouting late at night, but admitted she couldn't see who it was. Another swore he saw the Dawson boys near the Keller property on the evening of the attack, but under cross-examination, he faltered, admitting it might have been someone else in the poor lighting. Photographs were presented of the damage, but no fingerprints or concrete evidence tied the Dawsons directly to it. The Dawsons' lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Curtis Blake, thrived in the ambiguity. He painted Keller as a paranoid old man, lashing out at innocent youths, suggesting that the property damage might even have been self-inflicted to gain sympathy. His arguments were slick, peppered with humor that drew occasional laughter from the gallery. On the other side, the prosecutor leaned heavily on the Kellers' long-standing reputation for honesty. She reminded the jury of the escalating pattern of incidents, stressing that coincidence could not explain it all. Yet even she struggled with the lack of a smoking gun. Through it all, Emily had sat quietly in the gallery with Max at her side, listening to the adults argue as though they were speaking a different language. She saw things differently, in a way that made perfect sense to her, but seemed invisible to the grown-ups. She remembered that night, the barking, the fear in her mother's eyes, the way Max had thrown himself against the door, as though desperate to chase the intruder away. She hadn't seen the figure clearly either, but she knew Max had. When she had first told her mother, "Max knows who did it," her mother had sighed and said gently, "Dogs can't talk, sweetheart." But Emily had insisted. She had watched Max's behavior every day since the attack. Each time the Dawson boys passed their yard, Max's hackles rose. When Richard Dawson himself walked down the street, Max barked, low and angry, not his usual friendly self. Yet when neighbors came by, the mailman, the grocer, even strangers, Max wagged his tail without suspicion. To Emily, the truth was obvious. Max had identified the guilty party in his own way, but no adult seemed willing to listen. Until now. In court, after Emily's startling declaration that Max knows the truth, murmurs swelled again. Blake, the Dawsons' lawyer, rose smoothly to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, voice dripping with mock courtesy, "with respect, we cannot waste this court's valuable time on the fantasies of a child. Dogs cannot testify. Shall we next consult the family cat?" Laughter rippled from the Dawson side of the gallery. But on the other side, a few townsfolk frowned. They had grown up with dogs. They knew how sharp their instincts could be, how easily they sensed things humans overlooked. Judge Bennett tapped his gavel, silencing the chatter. "Mr. Blake, the court will decide how to proceed. Sit down." Blake obeyed, though the smirk never left his lips. The prosecutor, meanwhile, leaned forward. "Your Honor, while the law does not recognize animals as witnesses, the child's perspective may still be relevant. She was present the night of the incident. I request that she be allowed to continue." The judge studied Emily, who sat with her hands clasped tightly, her eyes wide but unwavering. For a moment, he felt the weight of the room pressing in. This was highly irregular. But irregular or not, The jury looked more alert than they had in days. Perhaps it was worth hearing her out, if only to satisfy the growing curiosity. He nodded. Proceed. The prosecutor smiled gently at Emily. Emily, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that night? Emily glanced at Max, who raised his head as if sensing the moment. She took a breath. I was in bed when I heard the noise. Max barked. He never barks like that unless something is really wrong. I ran to the window. I saw someone running, but it was too dark to see their face. Max, he wanted to chase them. He was furious. She paused, her small voice steady. And ever since that night, whenever Mr. Dawson or his boys come near, Max acts the same way. He remembers. He knows. The jury exchanged glances. The gallery leaned in. Even Judge Bennett felt a shiver at the conviction in her words. It wasn't evidence. Not in the legal sense. But it was something else, something raw and human that the cold logic of the trial had been missing. The central dispute had always been about more than broken windows. It was about trust, about truth buried beneath layers of bitterness. And now, with one child's voice and the loyalty of a dog, the case had taken a turn that no one in that chamber could ignore. For the first time, the Dawsons didn't look amused. Richard Dawson's jaw tightened. His sons shifted uncomfortably. Max's eyes never left them, unblinking, as though he too understood what was at stake. And the entire courtroom felt it, the beginning of a shift, the faint cracking of certainty in a trial that had been deadlocked for too long. Emily Carter had never been in a courtroom before. To her, it didn't look like the halls of justice she'd seen in movies. It wasn't grand or glittering. Instead, it was heavy with polished wood, dim light streaming in from tall windows, and the scent of dust mixed with old paper. To the adults, it was just another county chamber. To Emily, it felt enormous, as if every sound echoed louder, every stare weighed more, and every breath carried importance. She swung her legs nervously in the witness chair, her shoes not quite reaching the floor. She felt small, not just in size but in voice. Everyone here was taller, older, louder. The lawyers spoke in words she sometimes didn't understand, words like precedent and circumstantial. The judge spoke with authority, his deep voice cutting through the room. And then there was the jury, 12 strangers sitting stiff and watchful, their faces serious, their eyes always studying. Emily wondered if they thought she was silly. Adults often did. When she talked about Max and how he understood things, grown-ups smiled in that way. It wasn't really a smile, the one that said, "That's sweet, but it's not real." Her own mother had done it more than once. But Emily knew what she knew. Max knew the truth. She remembered that night vividly. The sound of shattering glass had pulled her out of sleep, her heart pounding. She had crept from her bed, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor, and peeked through the curtains. A shadow moved fast, darting into the street. She hadn't seen a face, only the shape of a man, the way he ran. But Max had seen more. She remembered how he barked, not his normal bark, the one he used when the mailman came, or when squirrels teased him in the yard. This bark was deeper, more urgent, his body trembling with fury as he tried to leap through the door. Emily had been frightened, but she also felt a strange certainty. Max knew. Dogs always knew. She'd read once that dogs could smell fear, sadness, even lies. Max was more than a pet. He was her protector, her best friend, and sometimes she thought he understood her better than any person did. That night, as the shadow disappeared, she had clung to his fur, whispering, "It's okay. You're brave. You'll keep us safe." Max had licked her cheek, his tail thumping, as if to say, "I promise." And now here they were, in a place where promises were supposed to matter most. The prosecutor leaned toward her with a kind expression. "Emily, do you remember what you told us earlier?" Emily nodded. "That Max knows who hurt Mr. Keller's house." Some in the gallery chuckled under their breath, but she didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady on the woman. "Can you explain to us what you mean by that?" Emily looked down at her hands for a moment. She wanted to get it right. Adults didn't listen if you stumbled. Then she lifted her head. "Max never barks unless there's a reason. That night, he barked louder than ever. He was angry. And since then, he only barks that way at Mr. Dawson and his boys. Not at anyone else. Not even strangers. Just them." The jury leaned in slightly. Emily noticed. It gave her courage. The Dawson's lawyer sprang up, his voice dripping with false amusement. "Your Honor, are we truly entertaining this nonsense? A child claims her dog, then point to the guilty party? What's next? The seance?" The gallery tittered. But Emily didn't shrink. She turned her head slowly toward him. Her voice was small but sharp. "It's not nonsense. You don't know Max." The lawyer's smile faltered, just for a second. Judge Bennett raised his gavel. "Mr. Blake, you'll have your chance to cross-examine. Sit down." Emily let out the breath she'd been holding. She glanced at Max, who sat quietly beside her mother in the gallery. His eyes met hers, calm and golden. He wasn't barking now. He didn't need to. His steady gaze gave her strength. The prosecutor continued. "Emily, how do you feel when Max barks like that at the Dawsons?" Emily thought carefully. "I feel like he's telling me something. Like he's saying, 'That's the one. That's who I saw. Do you believe him?' "Yes," she said without hesitation. "He never lies." The words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. Even Judge Bennett, who prided himself on logic, felt a ripple inside. Children had a way of cutting through complexity, of speaking truths adults found uncomfortable. Dogs, too, carried an honesty unclouded by ego or guile. And here they were, child and dog, united in a conviction no amount of courtroom theatrics could dismiss outright. Still, Emily wasn't naive. She could sense the skepticism in the room. She could see the jury's furrowed brows, the way some whispered to one another. She wasn't surprised. Adults rarely believe things that didn't fit neatly into their rules. But she had decided, before stepping into the witness box, that she would not let their doubt stop her. She remembered something her father had told her once, before he left for work on the day of the storm that damaged their roof. Sometimes the smallest voice can be the loudest, if it tells the truth. She hadn't understood then. Now she did. So she lifted her chin. "You don't have to believe me. But you should believe Max. He knows." The defense lawyer shot up again, impatient. "Your Honor, may I finally cross-examine this witness?" The judge nodded reluctantly. "Proceed, Mr. Blake, but keep it brief." Blake approached with the confidence of a man swatting at a fly. He crouched slightly, forcing his eyes level with Emily's, though his smile was condescending. "Emily," he said, voice syrupy, "you love your dog, don't you?" "Yes. And you'd do anything to protect him, wouldn't you?" "Yes. So, isn't it possible, dear, that you're just imagining all of this? That you want Max to be a hero, when in reality, he's just a dog barking at whoever he pleases?" Emily frowned. "No, you don't understand, don't I?" He pressed, his smile widening. "Dogs bark at squirrels, at mailmen, at shadows. Isn't that right? You can't honestly expect us to believe that your dog has the memory of a person." Emily's small hands tightened in her lap. She wanted to cry, but she wouldn't. She thought of Max, the way he had barked that night, furious, unrelenting, a sound she'd never forget. And she remembered the way he still barked, every time the Dawsons came near, as though warning her again and again. She looked straight at the lawyer. Max doesn't bark at shadows. He doesn't bark at people who are kind. He only barks at people who do bad things. He's smarter than you think. A ripple went through the gallery. Some smiled, others murmured. Blake straightened, caught off guard by the child's quiet defiance. Emily turned back to the judge. Please, let me show you. Just once, then you'll believe him too. The courtroom stilled. The jurors exchanged glances. Even Judge Bennett, seasoned and skeptical, felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew the next moments might shift the entire tone of the trial. Emily sat tall, her eyes shining with determination. She was no longer just a frightened little girl. She was a messenger, speaking on behalf of the one witness who couldn't take the stand. Max, and the adults, judge, jury, and lawyers alike, leaned forward, unable to look away. The child's perspective had just become the heartbeat of the trial. The stillness in the courtroom was almost eerie. Emily's last words, "Please, let me show you. Just once. Then you'll believe him too," hung in the air like a challenge that no one had expected from an 8-year-old. Judge Bennett cleared his throat, leaning forward. He had presided over countless cases, from petty disputes to felonies, but never had he been asked to allow a dog to give testimony. The very notion went against every rule in the book. And yet, the way the child spoke, with unwavering conviction, had stirred something in the room. The jury shifted uneasily. Some leaned in with interest, their pens forgotten in their hands. Others frowned, wary of being drawn into what seemed like theatrics. In the gallery, the townsfolk whispered among themselves. They had come to witness a legal battle, but now it felt like they were watching the opening act of something stranger, something they would talk about for years. Curtis Blake, the Dawsons' lawyer, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I must object," he said, his voice ringing with exaggerated indignation. "We cannot permit this circus to continue. Allowing a child to parade her dog in here as if it were a witness undermines the dignity of this court." Murmurs of agreement rose from the Dawson family's side of the gallery. Richard Dawson smirked, as if already savoring his victory. But the prosecutor quickly countered. "Your Honor, no one is claiming the animal can give sworn testimony. What the child is asking is a simple demonstration. It cannot be considered formal evidence, but it may illuminate her perspective for the jury." Judge Bennett tapped his pen against the bench, his mind weighing the arguments. He was not a man easily swayed by emotion, but he could not ignore the unusual electricity in the room. More importantly, he recognized the value of letting the jury see everything, even if it was unconventional. Closing it down too quickly might look like suppression, and jurors were keenly sensitive to that. Finally, he said, "The court will allow a brief demonstration. But I caution both counsel. This is not to be taken as direct evidence. It is merely to better understand the testimony of the witness." Gasps spread through the chamber. The Dawsons' lawyer threw up his hands in disbelief, muttering about absurdity. The prosecutor, meanwhile, suppressed a small, satisfied smile. Emily's face lit up with relief. She turned immediately toward her mother, who gave a nervous nod. At her feet, Max raised his head, sensing the sudden shift in the room. His ears perked, his tail swished against the floor, and his golden eyes fixed on Emily as though waiting for her signal. The bailiff looked uncertain, but obeyed the judge's order to bring the dog forward. Max trotted happily to Emily's side, his nails clicking against the polished floor. A ripple of amusement swept through the gallery. For a moment, it seemed harmless. A child and her pet, nothing more. But then Emily crouched, resting her hand on Max's back. She whispered softly in his ear, words no one else could hear. Max's tail stopped wagging. His posture stiffened. Slowly, deliberately, His head lifted, and his gaze locked on the rows of defendants. The room held its breath. Emily stood tall again, her voice steady. "Max, who did it?" For a split second there was silence. And then Max erupted. A deep, guttural bark burst from his chest, loud and furious, echoing off the courtroom walls. People jumped in their seats. Jurors flinched. Max surged forward. On the leash, his hackles raised, teeth bared, but not wildly, not at random. His fury was laser-focused. His body strained toward one man, Richard Dawson's eldest son, Tyler. The boy froze, his face draining of color. He tried to look indifferent, to shrug it off, but his foot tapped rapidly against the floor, betraying his nerves. The gallery exploded into noise. Gasps, whispers, even laughter tumbled through the room. The prosecutor raised her eyebrows, stunned. The defense lawyer sprang to his feet, shouting, "This is outrageous." She trained the dog to do that. A stunt. Nothing more. Judge Bennett banged his gavel furiously. Order, order, but order was slow to return. Even as the room quieted, Max continued to bark, his entire body rigid with intensity, never breaking his glare at Tyler Dawson. Emily's small hand stroked his fur, trying to calm him. "It's okay, Max." "You showed them." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of what had just occurred. Blake seized the moment to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, spreading his hands as though he were the voice of reason, "I urge you not to be swayed by a child's parlor trick. Dogs bark at anyone. They bark at uniforms, at loud voices, at nervous people, and what boy wouldn't be nervous in this courtroom? This display is nothing more than theatrics." His words were sharp, but his voice quivered slightly. He knew, as did everyone else, that Max's reaction had been too specific, too pointed, to be dismissed easily. The prosecutor, however, let the silence linger before speaking softly. "The defense is correct. Legally, this is not evidence. But what you just witnessed was not staged. That child did not coach the dog to bark at one person in particular. What you saw was instinct. An instinct, while not admissible in the strictest sense, can still speak volumes about truth." The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Some scribbled hurried notes. Others stared at Tyler Dawson, who was now shifting in his seat, avoiding their eyes. Emily looked up at the judge. "I told you," she said quietly. "He remembers." Judge Bennett studied her, then looked at Max, who had finally stopped barking, but still sat tense, eyes unblinking on Tyler. The judge's face was unreadable. But inside, he felt something stir. Not belief exactly, but doubt. Doubt that could not be ignored. Richard Dawson slammed a hand against the table, muttering angrily to his lawyer. Tyler hissed something under his breath, but the look on his face was unmistakable. Fear. For the first time in the entire trial, the balance had shifted. The demonstration was over, but its echo lingered in every corner of the courtroom. For a few heartbeats, no one in the courtroom moved. Max's barking had ended, but its echo clung to the walls like a ghost that refused to leave. The sharp, primal sound still rang in everyone's ears, leaving nerves raw and throats tight. Tyler Dawson's pale face said more than words ever could. His mouth twitched as though he wanted to sneer, to laugh it off like his father would, but the effort never reached his eyes. His hands drummed a nervous rhythm on the defense table. The boy who had spent weeks leaning back in his chair with smug confidence now sat forward, tense and cornered, as if Max's unrelenting stare had stripped him bare before the whole town. The jury noticed. 12 pairs of eyes fixed on him, and Emily, from where she stood, noticed too. She clutched Max's leash tighter, feeling his energy vibrating through her hand. He hadn't lunged. He hadn't barked randomly. He had chosen, without hesitation, his target. Then the whispers began. "Did you see that?" hissed a woman in the gallery. He went straight for the boy. Dogs don't lie. The murmurs swelled until Judge Bennett's gavel cracked against the wood. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." His voice was thunder, but it barely dulled the noise. The ripple of disbelief, suspicion, and wonder moved like a wave through the chamber, too powerful to contain. Richard Dawson slammed his hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. A mutt barking doesn't mean anything." His voice shook more than he intended, and that small tremor betrayed him. The jury caught it. Everyone did. His lawyer, Curtis Blake, scrambled to regain control. He shot to his feet, his smile thin and strained. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please. I urge you to use your common sense. This is a dog we're talking about, an animal. They bark at nerves, at smells, at the smallest twitch. The defendant's son is understandably tense under these circumstances. Wouldn't any boy feel uncomfortable with a courtroom staring him down while a dog growls at his feet?" The defense tried to laugh, to sweep it away, but his voice wavered, too loud, too desperate. The more he insisted, the more the jurors leaned back, unconvinced. The prosecutor rose slowly, her voice calm, almost gentle in contrast. "Your Honor, no one here is asking the court to accept this as legal proof. But what we witnessed just now was more than chance." A child pointed to her dog, and her dog responded with absolute certainty, targeting only one person out of an entire room. Instinct is not evidence, true, but instinct has a way of shining light where evidence cannot. She let the words hang, their weight sinking deep into the jurors' minds. Judge Bennett rubbed his temple, his face unreadable. He had always believed in the rule of law, in facts and admissible evidence. Yet he could not dismiss what he'd seen. The child's unwavering confidence, the dog's explosive certainty, the defendant's sudden unease. It wasn't proof, but it was undeniably powerful. The jury shifted again. One woman pressed her lips together. Her pen paused over her notebook. A man at the end of the row whispered something to the juror beside him, who nodded grimly. The room was changing. The defense's wall of denial was beginning to crack. Emily sat back down, her hand resting on Max's head. The golden retriever panted quietly now, calm once more, as if his job was done. She felt a swell of pride in her chest. For weeks, no one had listened to her. Adults had dismissed her words, waved away her certainty. But now, in this room full of doubters, Max had spoken for her. And they had all heard. Blake tried again, his voice sharp with forced authority. "Your Honor, I demand this be stricken from the record entirely. This charade has no place in a court of law." But the judge, though stern, did not grant the request. Instead, he leaned forward. "The court has already ruled this demonstration is not admissible evidence. However," he added, his eyes narrowing slightly, "the jury may consider it in the context of understanding the witness's perspective. That is all." Blake opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. He saw the judge's gaze, steel hard, and sat down with a huff, defeated for the moment. Richard Dawson's face was red with fury, but Tyler's remained pale, almost sickly. His brothers glanced nervously between him and their father, their bravado fading under the scrutiny of so many eyes. For the first time, the Dawson family looked less like victims and more like people cornered by their own secrets. The gallery buzzed again, even quieter now, as though the townsfolk feared breaking the spell of what had happened. This was the story they would repeat in shops and diners for weeks. The dog that pointed out the truth in a courtroom full of disbelieving adults. Emily's mother reached forward from the gallery, her face filled with a mix of pride and fear. She mouthed, "Good job," and Emily's heart lifted. Max leaned into her hand, his body warm and steady, his eyes still fixed on Tyler. The prosecutor broke the silence again. "Your Honor, I request that we adjourn for the day. I believe the jury needs time to reflect on what they've just seen before further testimony is presented." Judge Bennett hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Court will recess until tomorrow morning." The gavel fell. But even as people rose, gathering papers and whispering to one another, the energy did not dissipate. It clung to the room, heavy and unshakable. No one could erase the image of the dog's furious bark, his relentless focus on one boy, and the way that boy had flinched under the weight of it. The court had witnessed something it could neither explain nor dismiss. And though the law had not changed, the trial had. The next morning, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Word of what had happened spread like wildfire through the small town. Reporters leaned against the back wall, pens poised, while townsfolk pressed into every available seat, hungry for another glimpse of the spectacle they had heard about at the diner and post office all night. Emily sat quietly at the witness stand, her hand resting protectively on Max's back. The golden retriever sat tall, his calm composure a stark contrast to the nervous murmurs in the room. To Emily, he was simply being himself, steady, loyal, certain. But to everyone else, he had become something larger, a living compass pointing toward the truth. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Bennett entered with a grave face. He had not slept well. The images of yesterday's chaos, the dog lunging toward Tyler Dawson, the boy's pale face, the stunned jury had haunted him. Judges were trained to dismiss emotion, to see only facts. But even he had to admit, some moments defied neat boxes. Curtis Blake, the Dawsons' attorney, wasted no time. He shot up from his chair, his voice booming with manufactured outrage. "Your Honor, before this circus resumes, the defense requests a full demonstration, under controlled conditions, to prove what we have been saying all along, that this animal's behavior is unreliable, random, and irrelevant." He paced before the jury, his arms spread. "If this dog is to be paraded as some mystical truth-teller, then let him be tested properly. Otherwise, yesterday's debacle should be stricken from memory as nothing more than an emotional trick played on good people." A ripple of murmurs coursed through the gallery. Some nodded in agreement. Others shook their heads. The jurors looked at one another, curious but cautious. The prosecutor rose calmly. "Your Honor, we do not object. Let the defense have their demonstration. If they are confident the dog's reaction means nothing, then let the jury see for themselves." Judge Bennett exhaled heavily, then nodded. "Very well. The court will allow a demonstration, provided it remains orderly and safe." Blake smirked, turning toward the witness stand. "Bring the animal forward." Emily's grip tightened on Max's leash. She whispered softly into his ear, words of reassurance. His ears flicked, his tail gave a single swish, and he rose gracefully, walking with her to the center of the courtroom. His nails clicked against the floor with each step, punctuating the tense silence. Blake arranged the Dawson brothers in a line at the far end of the room, including Tyler. Richard Dawson sat back, arms crossed, glaring at the proceedings. He believed this would finally prove the girl a fool and restore their advantage. "Now," Blake said, addressing the jury, "let us watch. If this dog truly knows, as the child claims, then let him choose again. And if he barks at anyone, at random, you'll know it means nothing." The judge gestured for Emily to proceed. She looked up, her small face set with quiet determination. "Max," she said softly, "who did it?" The golden retriever froze, ears pricked. His head turned slowly down the line of brothers, nose twitching, chest rising with slow breaths. For a moment, the tension was unbearable. People leaned forward in their seats, holding their breath. Then, suddenly, Max lunged. A thunderous bark exploded from his chest, so powerful it echoed through the chamber. He strained against the leash, muscles rippling, his eyes blazing with focus. And just as before, he ignored every other face, every other body, until he was nose to knee with Tyler Dawson, barking furiously, the sound reverberating like a hammer against the walls. The gallery erupted. Gasps, shouts, and exclamations filled the air. Again, it's him again. Voices cried. Tyler stumbled back, his hands flying up defensively. His composure shattered. "Get him away from me," he shouted, his voice cracking. He shoved at the table, sending papers scattering to the floor. His face had gone beet red, and his eyes darted wildly between the jury, the judge, and his furious father. The defense lawyer stammered, trying to regain control. Coincidence. Pure coincidence. Dogs can smell fear, and the boy is obviously frightened after yesterday's nonsense. But his argument was drowned out by the murmurs of the jury, who now whispered furiously among themselves, pens scratching furiously across paper. Emily tightened her grip on the leash, pulling Max back gently. He obeyed, but his growls rumbled deep in his chest, his eyes never leaving Tyler. The prosecutor rose, her voice calm but piercing. Coincidence once, perhaps, but twice? In front of this court? Under the defense's very conditions? And always directed at the same individual? Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the truth doesn't need words. Judge Bennett slammed his gavel again, demanding silence, but his stern expression couldn't mask his unease. He looked directly at Tyler, whose trembling hands betrayed him. Richard Dawson hissed something at his son under his breath. His jaw clenched tight, but the boy wouldn't meet his father's eyes. The gallery was buzzing now, electrified by what they had seen. A man whispered, "That dog just picked him out like a knife." A woman replied, "I've never seen anything like it." The story had grown legs the moment Max barked yesterday, but today it had sprouted wings. Blake tried to speak again, but his voice faltered. The words tumbled out awkwardly, without the conviction that had carried him for most of the trial. Even he seemed to know the damage was done. Emily crouched beside Max, hugging him close. "Good boy," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. He wagged his tail now, calm again, as though satisfied he had carried out his duty. When the court finally adjourned, the jury left with furrowed brows, whispering furiously to one another. Reporters rushed out, scribbling headlines before the ink could dry. The Dawsons sat in silence, their arrogance now fractured. And at the heart of it all was the image no one could shake, the child, the dog, and the boy who had cracked under their combined gaze. The demonstration had not proven guilt in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of the town, of the jury, and perhaps even of the judge, it had revealed something undeniable. The truth was closer now than ever. The courthouse air had changed. It wasn't just the whispers in the gallery, the murmurs from reporters scribbling faster than their hands could keep up, or even the stunned looks on the jurors' faces. No, it was something deeper, almost tangible, like the scent of ozone before a storm. The certainty that the Dawsons had carried into this courtroom was gone, replaced by the unmistakable stink of fear. And it clung to one person most of all, Tyler Dawson. As he sat hunched at the defense table, his fingers drumming furiously against the wood, his skin pale and blotchy, Tyler looked less like the smug eldest son of a wealthy family and more like a trapped animal. His knee bounced beneath the table. His eyes flicked nervously from the jury to the judge to the retriever, sitting quietly by Emily's side, tail swishing against the floor in calm, steady beats. Max hadn't barked again since the demonstration. He didn't need to. His work was done. The way he sat there, chest high, golden coat gleaming in the shafts of morning sunlight, made him look almost regal, as if he were guarding a truth that no one else dared to speak aloud. The judge's gavel had restored order the day before, but the echo of Max's bark still lingered in everyone's memory. And when the bailiff called the court back into session, the jurors walked in differently. They weren't just 12 ordinary citizens anymore. They were 12 people who had witnessed something raw, primal, and unforgettable. Their eyes lingered on Tyler, some with suspicion, others with thinly veiled certainty. Curtis Blake rose, his face composed, but his collar damp with sweat. He launched into a fiery monologue, pacing before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we saw yesterday was nothing more than a dog reacting to nerves. Dogs bark, that's what they do. We cannot allow instinct to overshadow fact, emotion to override reason. The prosecution would love you to believe otherwise, but let me remind you, we are here for evidence. Evidence, not theater, not tricks, and certainly not the whims of an animal." He slammed his hand against the podium, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. The jury didn't flinch. They just kept watching him with wary eyes, and some of them, more damningly, glanced toward Tyler. The prosecutor rose after him, her demeanor calm as ever. She didn't pace, didn't shout. She simply folded her hands and spoke with a quiet authority that drew the room in. "No one here is asking you to convict a boy based on a dog's bark. That is not the law, nor would it ever be. But you are human. You know the difference between randomness and instinct. Twice now, under two different conditions, the animal pointed to the same individual, without hesitation, without prompting. That does not prove guilt. But it should make you ask, why him? Why always him? What does he know that we have not yet uncovered?" Her eyes slid toward Tyler, then back to the jury. Sometimes truth is not shouted from the witness stand. Sometimes it trembles at a table, trying not to be seen. Tyler's cheeks burned crimson. He shot up suddenly, his chair screeching across the floor. "This is a joke," he blurted out, his voice shrill. "You think a stupid dog can say I did something? He doesn't know anything. He's just a dumb animal." The courtroom froze. Curtis Blake rushed to his side, hissing under his breath. "Sit down," he whispered harshly, tugging at the boy's sleeve. But Tyler's voice had already cracked in front of the entire room, carrying far more weight than he realized. His outburst had been too raw, too defensive, too panicked. The jury leaned in. Some raised their eyebrows. Others scribbled furiously on their notepads. The gallery erupted in murmurs until Judge Bennett's gavel slammed down. "Order! Mr. Dawson, control yourself, or you will be held in contempt." Richard Dawson's face was stone, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle in his cheek twitched. He turned on his son, his glare sharp enough to cut glass. Tyler's eyes darted away, his bravado collapsing under the weight of both his father's fury and the jury's scrutiny. Emily, still at the witness stand, felt her chest tighten. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply looked at Tyler, her small hand stroking Max's fur. She knew, in the way children sometimes knew things adults couldn't explain, that the truth was pressing at the edges, trying to force its way out. The prosecutor didn't miss her chance. She stepped forward again, her voice even softer now, almost like a lullaby. "Mr. Dawson," she said, looking straight at Tyler, "no one here has accused you directly. Not once, but you've just stood and defended yourself against a charge that hasn't been spoken. Why do you feel so compelled to shout your innocence when no one has yet called you guilty?" Gasps rippled through the gallery. Blake shouted an objection, his voice hoarse, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted. The jury's eyes locked on Tyler again, this time sharper, more suspicious. Judge Bennett sustained the objection, his gavel cracking again. The jury will disregard the prosecutor's statement, he ordered, but his voice lacked its usual firmness. Even he couldn't ignore the spectacle that had just unfolded. Blake yanked Tyler back into his seat, whispering furiously. Tyler dropped his head, his hands trembling visibly now. Richard Dawson leaned in close, his face twisted with anger, whispering something venomous that only his sons could hear. The younger boys stared at the table, their confidence broken. The dynasty of arrogance was crumbling before the town's eyes. The jury was no longer just listening to lawyers. They were reading body language, watching cracks widen, noticing fear where there should have been calm. And every glance, every whisper, every scribbled note brought them closer to a conclusion the defense could not stop. For Emily, the shift was like watching the sun break through clouds. She didn't fully understand the law, or the weight of the jury's murmurs. But she could feel it. People were finally listening, believing, not just her. But Max, when court recessed that afternoon, the gallery spilled into the streets, buzzing like a hive. "The boy's hiding something," one man said. "You saw how he jumped." "That dog knew," another replied. "Dogs don't lie?" Reporters scribbled feverishly, already drafting headlines that would stir the town even further. Inside, the Dawsons sat in silence. Richard glared at his sons, his face a thundercloud ready to burst. Tyler's shoulders sagged under the weight of his father's fury and the courtroom's suspicion. He knew, though he couldn't admit it yet, that the walls were closing in. The turning point had arrived. The jury had seen more than evidence. They had seen fear. And fear, unlike facts, could not be hidden behind legal arguments. The trial wasn't over, but the outcome no longer seemed certain. The courthouse smelled of tension. It was thick in the air, heavier than the polished wood and old paper that usually defined the space. When the trial resumed for what everyone knew would be the final day, the gallery was overflowing. Townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder, reporters jostled for space, and the hum of whispered speculation filled every corner of the room. Everyone wanted to know, would the boy break? Tyler Dawson sat stiff at the defense table, his face pale, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. His hands shook slightly as he shuffled papers he didn't need, his movements jerky, unnatural. Richard Dawson sat beside him like a coiled snake, anger radiating from every line of his posture. His lips never moved, but his glare told his son everything. Do not speak. Do not falter. Do not bring shame to this family. The jury entered, their faces set with the seriousness of people who had been transformed by what they'd seen. They weren't just citizens anymore. They were witnesses to something larger than a trial. They had seen a dog bark twice, not at random, but at the same boy, and they had seen that boy nearly unravel before their eyes. They carried the weight of that with them as heavily as the law itself. Judge Bennett struck his gavel, his face grim. He looked more tired than usual, as though the weight of presiding over such a strange, uncharted trial had finally begun to show. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we will now proceed with closing arguments before the jury is charged to deliberate." Curtis Blake stood first. His suit impeccable, but his voice ragged from the strain of days spent fighting a losing battle. He paced the floor, his words sharper than ever. "You have seen emotion," he told the jury, his fingers stabbing the air. "You have seen theatrics. A dog barking, a child pointing, the gallery gasping. But none of that is evidence. None of that proves guilt. If you allow yourselves to be swayed by feelings rather than facts, then you undermine everything this court stands for. The law is built on reason, not instinct. On proof, not superstition." He spun back toward Tyler, gesturing broadly. "This boy is innocent. He has been painted as guilty by nothing more than coincidence and fear. Do not let yourselves be tricked. Do not let a dog decide this case. He sat heavily, his hand trembling as he pulled a glass of water to his lips. The prosecutor rose, her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't pace. She didn't shout. She simply walked to the center of the courtroom, folded her hands, and let the silence draw the jury in. "You're right," she said softly. "This is not about a dog deciding a case. This is about people deciding a case. You, the jury." She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the Dawsons. "But you saw what I saw. Twice, under different conditions, that animal reacted, not randomly, not wildly, but specifically. Twice he pointed at the same person. And twice, that person reacted not with calm denial, but with panic, fear, outbursts, shouts." Her eyes returned to the jury. "Fear leaves traces. Guilt leaves shadows. You have seen those shadows in this courtroom. I cannot tell you what exactly this boy has done. That is for the evidence to prove. But you can see for yourselves that something is not right. And sometimes instinct guides us toward the truth the law struggles to reach." She paused, then smiled faintly. "A little girl believed her dog could speak when she could not. Yesterday, you saw that maybe, in his own way, he did. The rest is up to you." The courtroom was silent as she sat down. Judge Bennett gave his instructions to the jury, his voice firm but distant, as though even he understood this was no ordinary case. Then the jurors were led out, their faces solemn, their notepads clutched tight. The hours that followed crawled by. Emily sat quietly with Max, stroking his fur. The dog lay peacefully at her feet, as though the storm around him meant nothing. Tyler sat slumped forward, muttering to himself, his father's hand clamped like a vice on his shoulder. The gallery buzzed with speculation, then fell quiet again, waves of impatience and anticipation rolling over the room. When the jury finally returned, the tension snapped taut. "All rise." The forewoman stood, holding the slip of paper in her hand. Judge Bennett nodded. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The paper was passed to the judge, and back to the clerk. The words rang through the courtroom with a clarity that made Emily's heart race. On the charge of property destruction, we find the defendant family, represented by Tyler Dawson, guilty. Gasps erupted. Richard Dawson surged to his feet, shouting protests, but the gavel cracked down again and again. The verdict was done. The law had spoken. But it was what happened next that would be remembered. Tyler's face crumpled. He dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I didn't mean to," he blurted out suddenly, his voice breaking through the noise. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I was just Dad told me. We thought it would scare them. Not Tyler." Richard roared, grabbing his son's arm, but the boy wrenched away, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean it. I'm sorry." The gallery gasped again, louder this time. The confession hung heavy in the air, raw and undeniable. The judge's gavel slammed, his voice like thunder. "Order! Order!" But it was too late. The truth had burst free, and no gavel could push it back down. Emily sat very still, her hand on Max's head. The dog leaned against her leg, calm as ever, his eyes watching the chaos as if he had known all along this moment would come. The Dawsons were led away, their empire of intimidation crumbling in plain view. Reporters scribbled furiously, already drafting headlines that would travel far beyond the town's borders. Child and dog exposed Dawson family in courtroom. Drama. As the gallery emptied, people stopped to glance at Emily and Max. Some smiled, some nodded, some simply stared in wonder. She didn't feel like a hero. She was just a little girl who loved her dog. But she knew, deep down, that Max had given her a voice when no one else believed her. That evening, as the courthouse lights dimmed and the town buzzed with stories of what they had seen, Judge Bennett sat alone in his chambers. He stared at the gavel on his desk and at the empty courtroom beyond. The law was the law. Facts, evidence, procedure. And yet, he thought, sometimes the law needed a nudge from the unlikeliest of places. The trial would be remembered for years, not as the case of property damage, but as the case where a child pointed at her dog, and a dog barked at the truth. Emily walked out of the courthouse with Max trotting happily at her side, his tail swishing in time with her steps. She bent down and whispered, "Thank you, Max. You told them. You really did." And though he couldn't answer, his golden eyes glowed with a wisdom far older than words.